Welcome to the Freedom Cities podcast, where we explore bold new ideas in city building and improving regulation in the United States. Hi, David. Welcome to the Freedom Cities podcast.
Thank you very much.
So to start, can you tell me who are you and what are you working on?
My name is David Ernst. I've been trained as a software engineer, but I've been doing a lot of political work for the last decade now. At a high level, I'm working on trying to bring governance into the 21st century. I think a lot of the current democratic representative governance ideas were very innovative for 1776 and have not kept up with our modern age. There's a lot of scaling issues and just most people feel very checked out, and we get really poor results because of it.
Cool. So I guess explain that a little bit more, right? Like, what specific changes are you recommending? How would those changes change policy outcomes, right? Let's go a little bit more specific.
Yeah. So at a high level, I'm interested in really big fundamental systemic reform, moving representative ideas into the modern age. And so some very simple things. There's been some ideas pushed. There's this idea a decade ago Elon Musk was pushing. Obviously, his context has changed radically in the last decade. But at the time, he was saying in the Mars colony, in this new space where we can start with fresh rules, what if we gave everyone an app and they could vote directly on policy? Part of the presumption was that elected representatives, the theory goes, are bought by donors and special interests, and just regular people don't feel very connected to them. I don't think that's entirely right, but it's at the very least, it's injecting some new ideas. I think the big problem with that is that every last person is way too busy to be studying policy, and policy is really complicated but important. Government spending is 40% of GDP. And so what's really interesting is there's some really powerful new models of representation where instead of saying, okay, this million people in one district are all going to be represented by this single congressperson who doesn't know any of these million people's names, like how good of a representative are doing, you could actually pick your representatives yourself. It could be personally chosen. Just like you can go on YouTube and pick what content you like, or Instagram, pick what content you like, or TikTok or Twitter. And so you can have much more of a competitive landscape of representatives. And you can even mix and match. You could say things like, well, I really like the ideas from these people, and so I want to take 80% of what they're saying. But on these particular policy areas, there's these specialized people who have really focused on this issue. And I think when it comes to this particular domain area, they could be a lot better. So the point is just like our government matters a lot just in the sense that we're all paying 30% taxes or whatever we're paying. And we're definitely not spending 30% of our time trying to make sure that that money is being spent effectively and used well. And so we're like stuck in these really old ideas, and there's just so much technological improvement we've seen. Like we can be on a plane and talk to someone on the other side of the world, but our governance tools are still stuck in 18th century thinking.
Sure. Well, that's, I guess, like, what would it mean if you can pick your representative, right? Instead of typically in the US, right, you basically have two parties. You might have a primary vote where there might be, I don't know, between 2 and 8, 10 candidates running, and then you've got a regular election vote where it'll probably be 2 candidates that have a somewhat possibility of running, but right, like I think 95% of House members get reelected every term, so even there, it's limited. So like, what would it mean to be able to like choose your candidate from a wider variety of issues, right? Like what is the kind of the baseline decision making process that you're recommending we change?
Totally. So big picture, high level view, thinking like 10 years down the line, let's say, or 20 years down the line. First of all, the one constraint that we're currently working in is that 200 years ago, if you wanted to have representatives, they had to go to the Capitol. And so if you live on this side of the country, your representative has to actually go. Today, that's obviously not the case. 95% of people have internet access at home in the US, and we can all connect to this stuff all the time. So that constraint is gone. So very specifically, one of the political ideas in terms of power and who's wielding power and holding power, right now we have this model of elected representatives and regular citizens. And so let's say at the US federal level, which is quite large, we have 300 million citizens, or like 340 million at this point, and 500 members of Congress, 535. And so it's like 1,000,000 to 1. And so it's like this two-class system, basically. It's elected officials and everybody else. And so part of the idea is instead you introduce this notion of voting power. And so everybody starts with voting power of one. We're all equal citizens to start with. But then as more and more people delegate to you as their representatives, they say, look, Mark, when it comes to governance issues or new jurisdictional issues or regulatory issues, clearly you're someone that spends all day, every day on it. And so you get tens of thousands of people that all say, look, Mark, I want you to represent me on these issues. And so they're in software saying, make Mark my representative, either across the board or on these specific issues. And so your voting power is increasing. You see the number go up. Sort of like follower count is going up on YouTube or what have you. And what that means very specifically, this idea of voting power, is anytime there's any policy question, anytime there's a bill or something coming before the legislature, every last person can vote on it directly if they want, like that vision that Elon was talking about a decade ago, if you can vote directly in the app. But if you don't vote on it directly, the software looks up how did your representative vote on it and just copy their position. And so you're effectively voting on behalf of 10,000 people. And another really powerful key piece of this is that the voting power accumulates. And so let's say 10,000 people are delegating to you, but then there's some very specific issue around some zoning regulation issue that matters. And you happen to know this person has studied the issue for a year straight and knows way more about it. So you can actually direct all 10,000 of your voting power to that person, delegate multi-level, and lots of other people. And so on that one issue, that person is empowered to really take the time to study it. And that's really the issue, is that as 1 out of 300 million people, why would I spend any time looking at this stuff? My vote doesn't really make any difference. And so right now we're trapped in this opt out, which is what the vast majority of people do, don't study it, or spend a huge amount of time studying it, but get very little reward. And so we're just trying to balance the incentives from almost like a behavioral economics point of view, where your cost benefit makes a lot more sense to actually study issues, become informed, and you have good accountability. So it's sort of does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, like everybody has their vote, but they can basically delegate to anyone. There's multi-layer delegation, and then presumably there's some decision-making process that would decide, like, here are the voting categories. This is a vote on regulation, this is a vote on taxes, this is a vote on welfare, and there'd be some kind of more or less complicated thing that would then put votes into one or more of these buckets, where then the delegation would then be automatic unless the person chose to vote on that issue. One kind of question, like if I look at the last few hundred years, right, like formal voting systems matter, but I tend to think they're a little bit overrated, right? If you look at basically Anglo countries, right, like the UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, they've all turned out pretty similar. Obviously, there's some differences, but right, they're much more alike than they are compared to, I don't know, like US or Mexico or US and Brazil or US and Ethiopia. And they have pretty substantially different voting systems, right? People often can attribute America's success to our Constitution. And I like our Constitution, but like if you look at functionally what it's given us much stronger free speech laws. Like that's a good thing. I support that. Like much stronger gun rights. Again, like you can argue about whether that's a good thing or not, but in terms of like order of magnitude differences, that seems to have been baked into the culture from the beginning.
Yeah. Any more you want to say?
No, that's, yeah, just get your response.
Yeah, totally. I mean, at a high level, I think what you're saying is totally right. I don't disagree with any point that you made. If I wanted to highlight governance difference, I mean, the most famous one that I imagine you probably quote often would be like Singapore versus Malaysia, like similar population, side by side, seemingly quite large difference in outcomes. I'm guessing your response would be that's probably more on the judicial side than on the legislative side.
I don't know enough about Singapore and Malaysia. I mean, my initial response, I'm not sure they're the exact same populations. I think Singapore's like, no, 90% ethnic Chinese. I think Malaysia was around 50-50. And then two is, right, Singapore is a city state and it's on a port. And so, right, cities tend to be more prosperous than rural areas. Being on a port tends to be more successful. And then basically they got lucky with Lee Kuan Yew, who's arguably the most successful political leader of, right, like the 20th century. Obviously, right, you've got big divergence between North and South Korea. Not to say governance doesn't matter, just like trying to calibrate at what point does governance matter versus culture? How does culture impact governance, right? It's a pretty complex interplay of things.
100%. And I'm definitely not advocating anything like a silver bullet or one quick trick to change everything. The point is just, again, the magnitude of the scale we're dealing with is so large. So in the US, government spending is 40% of GDP. The average tax rate is something like 30%. It can be higher or lower depending on how everything breaks down. And so it's like, if I'm working 5 days in every week, 2 out of every, like 1 and 2/3 of those days, my labor is going into the general tax fund. And yet, like, every single last person is doing that. And yet we're not necessarily spending that much time on the governance side of things. And so if you could have, 1% more effective spending when your federal budget is $4 trillion, that's $40 billion. But then to your bigger point, just about looking at the last few hundreds of years, I think that's right. And I think part of the point is that we're just not in the same place we were 100 years ago. Like, the world has changed so much. So a very simple thing that I look at is that the US population, I think, has 8x'd since in the last 100 years, from about 1920 or so. It doubled and then doubled and then doubled again. But what's interesting is in that same time period, the number of members of the House of Representatives got locked in. So I think it was like 1915 or so was the Congressional Apportionment Act of 1915 or some jargony name like that. And so the point is that the amount of connection between representative and constituent was that, okay, this is what we think is right at this time period. Now the conditions have changed, but we haven't adapted. And so at the time of the constitutional authorship in 1789, it was actually 30,000 to 1 was like that representative ratio. And there's a really interesting study from, I'm blanking where it was from, but it looked at like all the OECD nations across like 30 different nations or something like that. And it just plotted on an XY chart. And it said the X chart is that ratio, that representative ratio. How many constituents does each representative have in the lower house of the national parliament or Congress or assembly or whatever it's called? And then on the y-axis, it just plotted what is the reported satisfaction of government. And it turns out there's a perfect inverse correlation, according to this one analysis. And that if people just feel like their voice is being diluted a lot, they're not reporting a lot of happiness. And so that's definitely one signal.
Cool. And so I guess, right, this is a big kind of change. Like, how do you test it? How do you start small? What is kind of the first step you see? Are there like real world examples kind of, I don't know, in games and crypto, right? Like, how do you actually roll out these changes in practice?
There have been some experiments that have taken place already. This whole idea, the delegation idea, the most popular term for it is liquid democracy, because the idea is like it injects more liquidity into the representative system. It's not quite as like locked in. And so those ideas go back like since 2001, I think, was this PhD thesis from this researcher studying in Switzerland named Brian Ford, and he kind of formalized the model. And so a lot of people have been exploring it. There have been a bunch of groups in Northern Europe and like Germany, the Netherlands, and the so-called pirate parties that have been using this internally for some experimentation. There's some testing within Google as well for like, there's a big charity budget and like, what do we put in the corporate cafeteria? And so there's some real world experiments with that. There's some like university groups experimenting with it on a small scale. But yeah, you're totally right. It's a really tricky question. So I've been for the last 8 years building software to make this easy and talking about it with people and looking for places to run pilots. There's been some interest in like homeowners associations as well, among groups of like a few hundred people, where there's again these kind of same issues, and like neighborhood groups. The tricky thing is that my personal model is that it's sort of like it's a scaling issue. So like the idea of democracy itself goes back to ancient Athens, and back then it was like 40,000 people gathering in the Athenian city town hall in the Agora. And then you have the current model of like elected representatives, which was designed for like a few million people or a pre-industrial sort of population base. And so I think of this as the most effective model you can use for modern hundreds of millions of people countries, especially. And so there is a really kind of frustrating issue where it's like you can try out in these small cases, but you don't really see the benefits until the big cases. The other thing I'd say that I hope is obvious is like we're not trying to push for some nationwide constitutional amendment or anything like that. There is a trick that you can do, which is just do it seat by seat. And so you can have existing elected representatives say, I want to start making my voting decisions in my parliament or assembly be based on this. Most incumbents are not interested in that whatsoever. And so what a lot of people have done, including myself, is actually run for office and say, look, I'm just running to be a way to try out this system. If I get elected, I'm pledging that 100% of my votes will be decided by this new system. Doesn't matter what I think. I mean, I'll participate in the voting itself, but just like anyone else. And so if all you have to do is win a single race for one of these elected seats, which lots of people do all the time, much easier than getting a constitutional amendment, and then we can try it out on just one seat. So like the race I ran for was for the California Assembly, where there's 80 seats. And so this would just be one of them. 79 stay exactly the way they are. One changes. We get to try it out. And it was pretty popular. I mean, a lot of people liked it. I didn't win the race, obviously, but so more and more people have been doing stuff like that. And so that's another way that you can kind of try it out without requiring every last person to make it legally binding on day one. And then, of course, the really exciting thing, of course, why I think we're talking is new jurisdictions, freedom cities, competitive governance, much more experimental place. You mentioned the crypto example with the DAOs. There's lots and lots of interest from the crypto community because they're used to this sort of decentralized model and they're really excited about it. I think there's some like other issues there that get into like who's actually participating, and those are very like financially return driven, much less like, we're paying taxes into this thing. It has more of a corporate vibe than like this is our rules that we're living by as neighbors. But I think new jurisdictions are really exciting, and that's kind of part of how I got really excited about this world that you've been such a champion of, and just this idea of competitive governance. I mean, that's really what I'm interested in. Is just more options, let people see what works or doesn't work, and allow people to choose the ones that serve them well and seem to be the most promising. And so that's really exciting.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Totally. Thank you.
This is Mark Lutter, and thanks for joining the Freedom Cities podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more conversations.